Once again, Christian greetings to all our valued listeners and viewers throughout the whole world, even more particularly to all Shepherd's Rod believers, and most especially to our beloved brothers and sisters in the United States of America. Special greetings to our brethren in Colorado, in Kansas, in Georgia, in Missouri, in Texas, in Arkansas, Chicago, Illinois, in California, in New York, Pennsylvania, Canada, Fiji Island, in Mexico, Spain, in Africa, Zambia, Pakistan, Kenya, to the United Kingdom, to our brethren in Australia, and also to our brethren in Malaysia and in Indonesia, and to the rest of the 144,000 living saints scattered abroad, greetings. May the good Lord bless you, my dear brothers and sisters. This is our special episode number 82 as the last final warning message just prior to the close of provision in the church. And on this time, let us focus first our attention to the subject, the 12 figurative months, by which such subject is under the trumpet study, and even more particularly to the fifth trumpet, by which the particular object in view is the 5 symbolical months, as mentioned on Revelation chapter 9, verse 5 and verse 6. Now I would like to read first Revelation chapter 9, verse 5 and 6. And to them it was given that they should not kill them, but that they should be tormented 5 months. And their torment was as the torment of a scorpion when he striketh a man. And in those days shall men seek death, and shall not find it, and shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. These two verses in Revelation chapter 9, verse 5 and 6, as under the subject the fifth trumpet, is one of the most important subject by which we need to focus our attention. Now, since the voice of inspiration admonish us that when we will be studying difficult subjects, in order to make it easy to comprehend, we need to establish principles, divine principles. Now, I would like to read to you this reading. This number 4. It says, the only way to understand difficult passages of the Bible is to hold fast to certain firmly established principles. It is written by E.G. Wagoner. So, I would like to read again. It says, the only way to understand difficult passages of the Bible is to hold fast to certain firmly established principles. So, I think the subject, the 12 figurative months, is one of the difficult subject. Therefore, we need to establish divine principles. So, this is the first divine principles. I would like to read in tract number 5. Tract number 5. It says on page 35, naturally then, tract number 5, naturally then, the first seal must precede the first trumpet, the second seal, the second trumpet, and so on, like the needle and the shuttle, rather than that all 7 seals must precede all 7 trumpets. So, the first divine principle is that each trumpet, there is a respective corresponding seal. And according to the shepherd's rod, each seal, its corresponding seal must precede its corresponding trumpet. And since we are studying the 5th trumpet, it must be that the 5th seal must precede the 5th trumpet. So that is the divine principle. So, if the application made does not exactly fit to the divine principle, the only tenable conclusion is that it is not the particular object in view. It is only serve as the groundwork. It says here, tract number 5, pages 33 and page 34. So though all such prophecies necessarily bring to our attention things which took place centuries ago, yet they are designed, like the Revelation, to show to God's people things which must shortly come to pass. Fulfilled prophecies are seen, therefore, to be employed by the Scriptures only as groundwork for that part of prophecy which is yet to be fulfilled. So the application made by B.T. Hotep that the fifth trumpet commenced at the first advent of Jesus Christ, when Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem in 4 BC, is only the groundwork, not the particular object in view, due to the fact that the fifth seal at that time did not as yet commence. The fifth seal, according to 2SR, let's read 2SR page 221. Summary of commencement and termination of seals. So it says here, but I would like to focus to the fifth seal. It says, the fifth from 1500 AD to 1755 AD. So that is the fifth seal from 1500 AD to 1755 AD. But the fact is that the fifth seal itself, there was also groundwork. And that fifth seal from 1500 AD to 1755 is only the groundwork, not the particular object in view. But even though in the groundwork still do not exactly portray the divine principle, because the divine principle is that each seal must precede its corresponding trumpet. So, to repeat again, the application made by B.T. Hotep is the groundwork, not the particular object in view. Now, secondly, here in 2TG, 2TG number 14, on page 15. Thus it is that chapters 8 and 9 bring us to the close of provision. Chapters 10 and 11 consequently sandwiched in chapters 8 and 9. And I think it is not difficult to understand the word sandwich, meaning it must be between. So, supposed to be the fulfillment of the prophecy on Revelation chapter 10. It is even more pertaining to Revelation chapter 10. And only the first 2 verses in chapter 11. Not the entire chapter of chapter 11. So, the fulfillment of chapters 10, or the main subject on chapter 10, which is including the first 2 verses in chapter 11, must be sandwiched between Revelation 8:13 and Revelation chapter 9, verse 1. And that statement cannot be applied to the application of the fifth trumpet on the first advent of Jesus Christ. Because Revelation 9 verse 1 was primarily fulfilled on the first advent of Jesus Christ. When Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem. But the fact is that the fulfillment of Revelation chapter 10 was still future at that time. So how could it be that Revelation chapter 10 is sandwiched between Revelation 8 verse 13 and Revelation 9 verse 1? So, it must be pointing to the particular object in view. Now, the third reason is that here in track number 5, on page 34, it says, in the main, however, the trumpets and the seals portray an event which is future from John's time. So both the 7 trumpets and the 7 seals. It says, in the main, however, the trumpets and the seals portray an event which is future from John's time and which takes place in heaven. So that is very important, brothers and sisters, that the main prophetic event, when we will be studying 7 seals and 7 trumpets, it takes place in heaven. Although, they also portray kindred events. Of these related events, some are contributory and some are consequent to the main prophetic event. The former naturally precede and the latter naturally follow it historically. Now, brothers and sisters, the occurrence on earth is called kindred events, related events, contributory, and consequent to the main prophetic event. The main prophetic event is in the heavenly sanctuary. So when we're studying the trumpet study, we need to follow the admonition given in track number 8, page 5, saying, so, correctly to understand this prophetic event in its entirety, we must carefully differentiate the part which takes place in heaven from the part which takes place on earth. So we need to carefully differentiate the part which takes place in heaven and the part which takes place on earth. Now, for example, brothers and sisters, in the subject, the 7 seals, and even more, particularly to the last seal, the 7th seal, the seal which is concerned the living, or the saints that will no longer to taste death. Let us distinctly separate the 7th seal, the opening of the 7th seal in the holy place, and the opening of the 7th seal in the most holy place. Not only to the 7th seal, but to its respective seal. The opening of the 5th seal in the holy place, and the opening of the 5th seal in the most holy place. And since our subject is concerning the fifth trumpet, it is closely connected to the fifth seal. That is pointing to the last seal under the temple. The one mentioned in Revelation 11 verse 1. As stated by the Shepherd's Rod in track number 5, 109. So, unless we could have clear conception concerning the fifth seal, which is connected to the fifth trumpet, then there is no possibility that we could comprehend the subject. The Shepherd's Rod plainly told us in 2SR page 187, saying, the seven seals in the sanctuary. In order to make a proper application of the seven seals, we must have a better understanding of the heavenly sanctuary, its origin, and the object of its existence, as taught by the earthly sanctuary built by Moses. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 5. So in order for us to have a better understanding concerning, or to have a proper application of the subject, the seven seals, then we need to have a better understanding concerning the judicial proceedings in the heavenly sanctuary. So, it utters the impossibility that you could understand the subject of the seven seals as well as the seven trumpets if we have no complete information concerning the proceedings in the heavenly sanctuary. The statement on 2TG number 12 on page 25, saying, and so, 2TG 12:25, and so when we speak of the seven seals, we are in reality speaking of the revelation. 2TG 12:25. You see, when we study the seven seals, then we study the entire book of Revelation. Therefore, the subject, the seven seals, is already include the subject of the seven trumpets. Because when we study the seven seals, we are in reality speaking of the revelation. And concerning the book of Revelation, although not only the book of Revelation, but as well as the book of Daniel, here in tract 15, page 13, saying, both seers, that is Daniel and John, distinctly declare that the event which they saw was the judgment. The difference between the two scenes is that Daniel was led to look into the sanctuary while preparations were being made for the judgment to convene. Whereas John was led to look into the sanctuary after the judgment had been set up. In fact, John not only saw the judgment and progress, but he saw the whole proceeding from start to finish. So, here we can easily discern that the entire book of Revelation is focusing to the entire proceedings in the heavenly sanctuary. And God showed it to John the Beloved, the entire proceedings from the heavenly sanctuary, from start to finish. So let us now go back to our subject, the 12 figurative months. As we stated, the 12 figurative months is under the subject of the trumpets. And even more particularly to the subject, the trumpet. Attached to Revelation 9, verse 5 and verse 6. By which the particular object in view is the 5 symbolical months. So, let us now gradually decipher this very important subject, the 12 figurative months. Now, brothers and sisters, according to track number 5, and first of all, track number 5 is the track that deals the subject, the 7 trumpets. So the statement here must be even more particularly applied to the subject, the 7 trumpets. Now, let's read track number 5, page 32. The statements which must shortly come to pass, Revelation 1, verse 1. And I will show thee things which must be hereafter, Revelation 4, verse 1. Go to say that the revelation is given with the one particular object in view of showing the things lying not behind but ahead of John's time, and with reference being made only incidentally to the past, in order to lay the necessary foundation upon which to build the future. So there must be particular object in view. One particular object in view in the book of Revelation. And that particular object in view cannot be addressed to the people living prior to the time of the end. Because according to SR 111, it says, the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation were written especially for the generation living at the time of the end, and not so much for the Roman world. See Daniel 12 verse 4. They had no understanding of the writings that pertained to the last days, and thus could not have profited by them. So, they have no understanding concerning the book of Daniel as well as the book of Revelation. Then how could they be profited by them according to the voice of inspiration? And in 2TG number 7, page 3, it says, Daniel was told to shut and seal the book, even to the time of the end. The book, therefore, was not for the understanding of the people before the time of the end. 2TG number 7, page 3. Although the shepherd's rod plainly told us in the old symbolic code, 3 symbolic code, 8 to 10, page 8, 3 symbolic code, 8 to 10, page 8, saying, this time must have begun when the book began to be opened. But if we must declare the beginning of that time in more specific terms, it, in a spatial sense, began in the year 1844. 3 symbolic code, 8 to 10, page 8. But, for sure, the particular object in view is in the judgment that pertains to the living. Because, according to 2TG number 12, page 30, the revelation, therefore, is to be more fully understood during the judgment of the living. 2TG number 12, page 30. So that is the particular object in view. In the time of the end, which is the judgment that pertains to the living. You and I, brothers and sisters, we are now living in that period of time. And according to track number 15, on page 35, it says, having now gone through these preliminaries, the student of advancing truth should be ready understandingly to study the revelation of the things which are to prepare the way and enable him wholeheartedly to know that now the time is at hand, that a knowledge of the revelation will enable him to stand in the great and dreadful day of the Lord. So the only way that we could be able to stand, survive the great and dreadful day of the Lord, is to have complete understanding concerning the book of Revelation. And brothers and sisters, the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, it seems that the book of Daniel is the type, and the writings of Sister White is the antitype. Because the book of Daniel deals only the judgment that pertains to the dead. The same with the writings of Sister White. Only deals with the subject, the judgment that pertains to the dead. And according to General Conference Basel, page 39, saying the judgment for the dead, furthermore, is not the message of the great and dreadful day. It does not even touch on the prophecies of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. But the book of Revelation deals both judgment that pertains to the dead as well as the judgment that pertains to the living. The entire proceedings from start to finish. The same with the Shepherd's Rod publications. Deals both judgment that pertains to the dead as well as judgment that pertains to the living. So there is no possibility that you could be able to comprehend the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation without the writings of Sister White and B.D. Hoggett. But we are more focusing to the Shepherd's Rod publications, for it typifies the book of Revelation. The information given is the entire proceedings in the heavenly sanctuary from start to finish. Now let's go back again to our subject. The 12 figurative months. And being attached to the fifth trumpet, it is automatically attached to the fifth seal because of the divine principle that each seal must precede its corresponding trumpet. So, the fifth seal, brothers and sisters, must precede the corresponding, the fifth trumpet. Now, who are they in this subject? There are two classes of people in under the fifth seal. Those will be resurrected at the second visible coming of Jesus Christ. And those who will be resurrected in the special resurrection. Now, it is very important to connect our subject to Matthew 20. So, the parable in Matthew chapter 20, verse 1 to verse 16. We know the first call, that is the Jewish church. And the second call, the apostolic church. And then the third call, Millerites movement. And then the fourth call, Laodicean church. And then the fifth call, the 11th hour call. So this is the arrangement. Hoping that you copy. Now, I think it is a very simple subject to all shepherds and believers, that according to the parable, the granting of rewards is reversed. The first to be rewarded is the fifth call. Then the next to be rewarded is the fourth call. And the next to be rewarded is the third call. And the next to be rewarded is the second call. And then the first call. All of them, brothers and sisters, the fourth call, the third call, the second call, and the first call will be resurrected in the special resurrection. Now, we know already that the fourth call is the Laodicean church. They will be resurrected in Daniel 12. How about the third call? The illustration in Matthew 20 is very easy to understand. Beginning from the last unto the first. Right? In Matthew chapter 20. So, let's read Matthew 20 on verse 8. So when even was come, the Lord of the vineyard said unto his steward, Call the laborers, and give them their hire, beginning from the last unto the first. So that is reverse order. It must be the first to be rewarded is the 11th hour call, the fifth call. The next thing to be rewarded must be the fourth call. Then the next must be the third call. The next must be the second call. And the next must be the first call. Now, what would you think? The first call. Let us go first to the first call. When will they be rewarded? I think all of us are familiar. It must be those who will be resurrected under Ezekiel 37. that dry bones in the vision of Ezekiel, Ezekiel 37. That is from Abraham down to Jesus Christ, because that is the third seal. Ezekiel 37 is under the third seal. Now let's read to us our page 221. It says here, summary of commencement and termination of seals. Then focusing to the third seal, it says, the third from Abraham to Christ. So that is the third seal. From the call of Abraham up to Jesus Christ. And we know that the kingdom mentioned in Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter 8 is the premillennial kingdom, the literal, physical, premillennial kingdom. Now, I would like to read first Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter 8, verse 11. And I say unto you, that many shall come from the east and west, and shall sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom mentioned here, it did not say the kingdom in heaven, but the preposition used is the kingdom of heaven. This is the premillennial or the literal, physical premillennial kingdom by which Abraham and Isaac and Jacob were already resurrected. So, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will be resurrected during probationary time because it is still gathering time, saying that many shall come from the east and west. And I do fully believe that all the Berean agree that that is the resurrection in Ezekiel 37. Reading to TG number 7. It says here, 2TG number 7, page 12 and 13. 2TG number 7, page 12 and 13. Now to line up all the resurrection, we must take into account also the one of Ezekiel. Ezekiel 37, verse 1, then verse 11 to 14. I will no longer read the entire verses, but just to read the commentary given on page 13. In this resurrection, only God's own people, Israel, arise with no sinner among them. Moreover, these do not meet the Lord in the air. They are taken to the land of Israel, Palestine. This resurrection, therefore, is not the same as the resurrection of 1 Thessalonians, of the Revelation, or of Daniel 12. It must be a separate one. So that is very plain. And who are they that have been resurrected in Ezekiel 37? The first call. The Jewish church. Brothers and sisters, they are the very first call, because according to the shepherd's rod, the first call, early in the morning. Let's read 2 SR 226, the morning call. It says 2 SR 226, the morning call. Therefore, the householders early hour call for laborers in his vineyard applies to the call of Israel out of Egypt. To SR page 226, it says, therefore, the householder's early hour call for laborers in his vineyard applies to the call of Israel out of Egypt. So that is the first call. And they will be resurrected under Ezekiel 37. Therefore, if the first call is the last to be resurrected, and it cannot be the second visible coming of Jesus Christ, how much more with the second, the third, and the fourth call? Remember, the first call is the last to be resurrected in the parable in Matthew 20. So those will be resurrected at the second visible coming of Jesus Christ. General resurrection is not included in Matthew 20 or in the parable of Matthew 20. As well as the great multitude which no man could number, the living saints, second fruits, are not included in the parable of Matthew 20. So, let's go back again to our subject, the fifth trumpet. According to tract number 5, now reading on page 33, that the divine principle is that the fifth seal must precede the fifth trumpet. But we are pointing to the proceedings in the heavenly sanctuary. Now, the proceedings that took place from October 22, 1844 are to those who will be resurrected at the second visible coming of Jesus Christ. Now, I would like to read to you 1 TG. 1 TG number 11. On page 10, it says, let's read the statement. The cleansing of the sanctuary, Daniel 8:14. The purification of it by blotting out from the books, Daniel 7 verse 10. The names of those who are found not eligible to come up in the first resurrection, the resurrection of the holy ones, Revelation 20 verse 5 and 6. Who are they that undergo the proceedings since 1844? Those who will be resurrected in Revelation 20 verse 5 and 6, and that is called the general resurrection at the second visible coming of Jesus Christ. The same with the statement in White House Recruiter. On let me see. Oh, I lost the page. So, let's proceed, brothers and sisters, to our subject. Therefore, the proceedings of the 5 distinct calls on Matthew chapter 20 is a separate one. And it must be considered in the heavenly sanctuary after the proceedings of those who will be resurrected at the second visible coming of Jesus Christ. Although it is a very long study and it will take time to explain that the proceedings of the 5 distinct calls in Matthew 20 commence on May 19, 2011. Or in Bible calendar, that is October 10, 2012. In Gregorian, that would be on May 19, 2011. But we will just focus to the general term. So, since our study is concerning the fifth trumpet, that fulfillment of the fifth trumpet in its perfect fulfillment must be after the proceedings of the fifth seal. And who are they, the fifth seal? They are those who will be resurrected after the resurrection of the fourth call. Because we are talking about Matthew 20. So the fifth seal mentioned here, in connection with the fifth trumpet, in the perfect fulfillment of the prophecy, must be the third call on Matthew chapter 20. So, to make it clearer, the fifth trumpet, on its perfect fulfillment, it must be after the entire proceedings of the third call, which is the Millerites movement, had been completely finished. And it must be both holy place and most holy place. And it was completely finished, brothers and sisters, on April 1, 2020. How do we know that was on April 1, 2020? With different angles, we can prove to you that that fulfillment is being fulfilled, or it was fulfilled on April 1, 2020. Now, I would like to read again Ezekiel 45, verse 18, saying, "Thus saith the Lord God, in the first month, in the first day of the month, thou shalt take a young bullock without blemish, and cleanse the sanctuary." This is the main subject that had been taught by William Miller, the cleansing of the sanctuary. And here, according to the Bible, Ezekiel 45 verse 18, the fulfillment of that event must be on the first day of the first month. Therefore, April 1. There are many Bible scholars, very intellectual people, but they failed to explain Ezekiel 45 verse 18. They have been confused. And almost all of them declared that it seems that the the Day of Atonement was transferred to April 1. Brothers and sisters, there is no such thing that God changes the ceremonial system that He Himself did establish. And for us, it is really wonderful in the beauty of perfection that 1,000 years ago, it was predicted beforehand that Ezekiel 45 verse 18 is pointing to the Gregorian calendar. And it was fulfilled on April 1, 2020, by which that April 1, 2020, in reality, in Bible calendar, it is October 10, 2021. And it will never happen again. And that is the reason why we call it infallible proof. Unquestionable knowledge. Right? In 1 TG 51, page 5. Unquestionable knowledge. This proof is infallible. It cannot be mistaken. It was already recorded in the Bible, brothers and sisters, that the last proceeding in the holy place, pointing to the holy place, cleansing of the sanctuary, that pertains to the dead, ended on April 1, 2020. By which, in reality, in Bible calendar, that is October 10, 2021. But in the most holy place, the one that had been finished at that time is the fifth seal, pointing to the third call. Therefore, the perfect fulfillment of the fifth trumpet must be from April 1, 2020 onwards. By which that trumpet must precede the perfect fulfillment of the fifth seal, pointing to the third call, which is the Millerites movement, who will be granted immortality after the 11th hour call, after the fourth call, and then the third call. So, that is very plain on the parable on Matthew 20. But the next step that we need to study is that it must be that the fifth trumpet, the subject in Revelation chapter 10, must be sandwiched. Or in other words, Revelation chapter 10, from verse 1 to verse 11, including verses 1 and 2. That prophetic verses, all of them must be understood, brothers and sisters, and fulfilled before the fifth trumpet, because it was sandwiched with Revelation 9. And Revelation 9 begin with the fifth trumpet from verse 1 to verse 13. Or from verse 1 to verse 12. Right? So, that is the reason why it is necessary for us to understand Revelation chapter 10. Although we already explained that in our previous episodes. And just to summarize Revelation chapter 10. The main subject on Revelation chapter 10 is the book of Daniel. The little book in Revelation 10 verse 2. According to track 2TG15 page 3. That little book is the book of Daniel. The perfect fulfillment of Revelation chapter 10 must be at that time when the book is open, because that is the description in the vision of John. The little book is open, meaning completely understood. And the prophet himself, betrothed, testified that there are still some portions of the book of Daniel by which they did not understand. Now, I'd like to read 3 Symbolic Code 8 to 10, page 8. It says, however, history proves that the prophecies of Daniel were not all revealed at once, but slowly. The fact that we as yet do not understand the whole book proves that some parts of it are yet closed. That was written in 1937. 3 Symbolic Code 8 to 10, page 8. So, that is the own testimony of the prophet, says that there are still part of the book of Daniel which is yet closed. So, it could not be the perfect fulfillment of the prophecy. And Revelation 11, verse 1, saying, and there was given me a reed like unto a rod. And the angel stood saying, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar, and them that worship therein. 100% this messenger in the pronoun me cannot be betrothed. Because this messenger had been commanded by God to measure the temple of God. Not only the temple of God, he is also to measure the altar. And not only the altar, as well as them that worship therein. And without any doubts, it must be pointing to antitypical Joshua. Because historically, when Moses died, the rod of God was passed into the hands of Joshua. So, this messenger in Revelation 11 verse 1 must be antitypical Joshua. And what does it mean by measure the temple of God? Because that is the divine command. Or in other words, that is the principal reason why God raised up antitypical Joshua, to measure the temple, to measure the altar, and to measure them that worship therein. There are 3 classes to be measured. And the only instrument that he could be able to measure the temple of God, the altar, and them that worship therein, is through the rod that had been given unto him. And it must be pointing to the Shepherd's Rod publications. Now, what does it mean by measure? Now, for example, here on the Old Symbolic Code, let's read. For Symbolic Code 10 to 12, page 4. For Symbolic Code 10 to 12, page 4. It says, the words measure and number are synonymous. For measuring must be accompanied by numbering. Moreover, as those who worship therein are people, they must be measured by numbering. Hence, from 1844 to the time of this prophetic reformation and organization is the measuring or numbering time, the gathering of the 144,000, the first fruits, the 12 tribes, or those who worship inside the temple, whereas the porch that is without is to be filled with the Gentiles, the second fruits, a great multitude which no man can number, who are to be gathered after the aforesaid reformation and reorganization is effected, just as is stated in the Revelation. The Revelator saw the 144,000 sealed, and after that, the great multitude. Now, in this reading, we can easily discern, brothers and sisters, that the particular object in view in the three classes to be measured is the worshippers, the 144,000. The particular object in view is pointing to the 144,000 living saints. But it is impossible that we could be able to measure the worshippers without first measuring the temple and the altar. Now here in track number 5, let's read. Track number 5 on page 109. Track number 5 on page 109. The investigative judgment of the dead, consequently, takes place in the heavenly temple only, whereas the investigative judgment of the living takes place in the heavenly as well as in the earthly temple. While the records are being made up for the books in the heavenly, the people are being investigated for the separation in the earthly. Matthew 22 verse 11 and 13. See Malachi 3 verse 1 to 3. And as the measuring is figurative of the same work, then it leads to the conclusion that the temple, the altar, and them that worship therein must figuratively represent the three classes to be judged. So in this reading, we can easily understand that the second fruits, represented by the court, outside the temple, they were no longer to be judged. Now, for sure, the judgment mentioned here cannot be in the most holy place, because the judgment in the most holy place is blotting out of sins and granting of rewards. If the great multitude will no longer be judged in the most holy place, then how could their sins be blotted out? And how could they receive the reward? Absolutely, therefore, the judgment mentioned there, by which the great multitude will no longer pass, is the judicial proceedings in the holy place. The temple, the altar, and the worshippers, these three classes are to be judged. All of them are to undergo the judicial proceedings in the holy place. What is the judicial proceedings in the holy place? Blotting out of names. Why is it that the great multitude will no longer be measured, will no longer be investigated? According to the Shepherd's Rod, in track number 5, on page 110, it says, the court, track number 5, 110, the court, in other words, is symbolical of the immeasurable, innumerable harvest of second fruits, brought in after the measurable, numerable harvest of first fruits, the 144,000. It is not measured, investigated, because it represents those among whom there are no bad to be cast out, for they are gathered in after the cleansing of the heavenly temple. Track number 5, page 110. Why is it that the great multitude will no longer pass the investigation in the holy place? Because they will be brought into the holy place. They will no longer pass the investigation in the holy place, due to the fact that they will be brought into the holy place after the holy place is completely cleansed. And the only names to be brought there is the names of the righteous. Therefore, there will be no more names to be cast out. No more names to be blotted out. But the temple, the altar, and the worshippers, all of them will undergo the proceedings in the holy place. And we know that the altar, the worshippers rather, points to the 144,000 living saints. The saints that will no longer to taste death. They will be translated to heaven without seeing death. And that is the particular object in view in the subject. The 12 figurative months, by which the focal point is the 5 symbolical months. And I would like to read again the statement in track number 5. It says here, track number 5, page 74. In track number 3, the harvest, the time from the baptism of Christ to the close of provision, is shown to be illustrated by 12 figurative months. 6 from Christ's baptism to his crucifixion. Then says 5 from the crucifixion to the ingathering of the first fruits. The 144,000, Revelation 14 verse 4. Leaving 1 month for the ingathering of the second fruits, the great multitude, Revelation 7 verse 9. So the 12 figurative months is divided into 2. Brothers and sisters, if you will divide 12 divided by 2 equals 6. And the first 6 figurative months, that is from Christ's baptism to his crucifixion. But the remaining 6 is divided into 2. The 5 symbolical months, that is from the crucifixion to the ingathering of the first fruits. And then, leaving 1 month for the ingathering of the second fruits, the great multitude, Revelation 7, verse 9. Now, let us ponder deeply, brothers and sisters, in this study. When would be the great multitude will be gathered? So, when we study the shepherd's rod, whatever subject, we need to harmonize the entire shepherd's rod publications. That is the admonition given by the shepherd's rod, right? It says, let us read 3 Symbolic Code number 1, page 9. So it says here, a conclusion which is based upon a single citation. Do the passage be ever so plain, but which conclusion cannot be harmonized with every other authoritative statement on the same subject, is not a safe and honest rule of interpretation. Then it says, if we cannot harmonize any one particular statement with the foregoing facts, we would then be better off to be out of harmony with the one than to disregard all the other statements none of which we can controvert. So, we need to harmonize. The same with the statement in Answerer number 3, page 41. It says, "Let us remember always to observe the inviolable rule that an interpretation of one inspired statement must harmonize with all other related statements." So, our subject is focusing to the two classes of living saints, 144,000 and great multitude. What is the first 6 figurative months? From Christ's baptism to his crucifixion. Track number 5, page 74. From Christ's baptism to his crucifixion. Now, in that statement, we need to establish again another divine principle. Track number 5 on page 26. It says, symbolical or literal, which? Track number 5, page 26. Or in other words, the shepherd is saying, if it is symbolical, it must be symbolical. If it is literal, it must be literal. He says, only when this question is rightly answered will we have the key, the correct interpretation to unlock this great symbolical treasure house of truth. And on page 41 it says, for if every term is not symbolical, how shall we differentiate those which are from those which are not? And how shall we know by which to define the truth? In that case, the baptism of Jesus Christ and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ being literal, it could not be the particular object in view. Because the trumpet study is a symbolical prophecy, not literal. So, it is very important now to study the perfect fulfillment of the prophecy concerning the 12 figurative months from Christ's baptism to his crucifixion. Right? By which it must be symbolical. And it could not be literal. So the application made being literal, that is only the groundwork. Not the particular object in view. Although we already proven that it is not the particular object in view. Due to the fact that the fifth trumpet precedes the fifth seal. Contrary to the proper application of the prophecy. Because the proper application must be the fifth seal must precede the fifth trumpet. And the fifth seal commenced in 1500 AD. Although, still, the fifth seal that commenced in 1500 AD, brothers and sisters, is not the particular object in view. That is still groundwork. The groundwork is divided into how many events? Kindred events, related events, contributory and consequent to the main prophetic event. So I would like to enumerate one by one. In track number 5, page 34. Brothers and sisters, the groundwork is enumerated one by kindred events, related events, contributory events, and the consequent to the main prophetic event. So, let's go back again to our subject concerning the 12 figurative months. If you will notice, the shepherds would connect the 12 figurative months to the 12 months parabolic harvest period, right? Now, let us connect first the subject, the harvest. Here in track number 5, on page 74, it says, the fact that the trumpets are figurative is another evidence that these 5 months are figurative time. But why should this period in which the locusts, the Christians, have power to torment men be limited to 5 months? It will be noted that the 144,000 are called the first fruits, denoting that they are sealed at the beginning of the harvest, the commencement of the time to separate the tares from the wheat. To the parable of the harvest, then we must go for the full explanation of the 5 months period. Or in other words, there is no possibility that you could be able to comprehend the subject of the harvest unless you obtain the full explanation of the 5 months period. Vice versa. You cannot obtain full explanation of the 5 months period unless we have a complete understanding concerning the subject of the harvest. And remember, in track number 3, on page 54, let's read. Track number 3 on page 54, it says here, the seed sower, the seed, the field, the season of cultivation and growing, and the season of harvest must together be perfectly calculated to illustrate the spiritual kingdom. Otherwise, the representation can only lead into error instead of into truth. The shepherd's rod made it so plain that the three periods, sowing, growing, and harvest, must be perfectly calculated. To illustrate what? To illustrate the spiritual kingdom. Not the literal, physical, literal kingdom. We read several times according to answerer number 2 on page 90, it says, so before the kingdom of God is established on this earth, it must indeed be spiritually established within us. If we are ever to qualify for admission when it is physically established upon earth, as it is in heaven. Accordingly, the spiritual kingdom of God within is within those who embody the principles of its rule before the physical kingdom is established. So the kingdom of God within is the regimen of the spiritual life. It is prerequisite to an inheritance in the eternal kingdom of God. Answerer number 2, page 90. So the shepherd's rod is plainly telling you and I that there is no possibility to be a part of that God physical, literal, premillennial kingdom unless if we will be a part of that God spiritual kingdom. And the admonition given in tract number 3, page 54, that the period of sowing and growing and harvest must together be perfectly calculated to illustrate the spiritual kingdom. It did not say to illustrate the literal or the physical literal kingdom. No. But rather to illustrate the spiritual kingdom. Why? Because if you fail to God's spiritual kingdom, then there is no more possibility to be a part of that God physical, literal kingdom. And the only way that you could be able to comprehend God's spiritual kingdom, it needs perfect calculation, because it says the period of sowing, growing, and harvest must be perfectly calculated in order to illustrate the spiritual kingdom. Otherwise, the representation can only lead into error instead of into truth. So the shepherd's rod is plainly telling you and I that unless these 3 periods, sowing, growing, and harvest, will be perfectly calculated, there is no possibility, brothers and sisters, that you could be a part of that God's spiritual kingdom, because this is the only way that such spiritual kingdom is illustrated by God. To have that perfect calculation, and without that perfect calculation, the representation can only lead into error instead of into truth. And of course, the only perfect calculation must be divine calculation. That is a calculation that cometh from God by the Spirit of Jesus Christ. Now, I would like to read here on tract number 3, on page 65. It says, and though harvest time is the shortest of all the periods of the harvest year, it says, I would like to read again. Tract number 3, page 65. And though the harvest time is the shortest of all the periods. What is the harvest? The shortest of all the periods. How many periods? Only 3. Sowing, growing, and harvest. Now, for example, let us read 2TG. Here in 2TG number 44, on page 32 and 33, 2TG 44, 32 and 33, Matthew 13, verse 24 to verse 30. So, let's read it. Says, let's read. I would like to read the upper portion. It says, since we as a people, 2TG 44, page 32 and 33, since we as a people know some of the signs of Christ's second coming, and none of the signs of the kingdom, We had better now concentrate on the signs of the latter. So we need now to concentrate the signs of the kingdom. Then the quotation was Matthew 13, verse 24 to verse 30. And then it says, this parable of the kingdom, you know, contains 3 periods of time. How many periods? 3 periods of time. First, the period of sowing. First, the period of sowing the seed, the time of Christ's ministry. Second, the period of growing, the time from the ascension of Christ to the harvest. Third, the time of harvest, a short period of time at the end of the world. Now, I would like to go back again, brothers and sisters, to track number 3, page 65. It says, of all the periods, harvest is the shortest. It says, harvest is the shortest of all the periods. How many periods? Only 3. Sowing, growing, and harvest. Since we are admonished by the shepherd's rod to observe grammatical rule, according to 2SR 118, saying this grammatical rule is followed in the scriptures, and it is one way to recognize present truth. 2SR page 118. And the word shortest is an adjective. An adjective has 3 degrees of comparisons. The first degree is positive. The second degree is comparative. And the third degree is superlative degree. So, the positive degree is short. The comparative degree is shorter. The word shortest is superlative degree. And grammatically, superlative degree is used only if we are comparing at least 3 or more than 3 objects. And since inspiration use superlative degree, shortest indicates that there are 3 periods: sowing, growing, and harvest. And harvest is the shortest of all the periods. Therefore, the harvest is shorter than growing time. The harvest period is shorter than sowing time. Now, let us establish first the period of the sowing time. So, let us read here in track number 3, page 58. It says, the 3.5 years from the beginning of Christ's ministry to His crucifixion, being the sowing time, and the harvest time, being the end of the world, then the intervening period is the time for the growing and ripening of the grain. So let us read again track number 3, page 58. It says, the 3.5 years from the beginning of Christ's ministry to His crucifixion, being the sowing time. So what is the sowing time? From Christ's baptism, according to that reading, to His crucifixion. So there are 3.5 years or 1,260 days. But if you will dig deeper, it does not exactly 1,260 days. Because when Jesus Christ was baptized, He immediately went into the wilderness and there being tempted by the devil for 40 days. So during the first 40 days after His baptism, Jesus Christ did not as yet preach the Word of God. Not until the 40 days wilderness temptation. So, it could not be exactly 1,260 days. So, if you will compare the 12 figurative months and the 12 parabolic harvest period, there is similarity, but there is also difference. Because the sowing period, although it was stated 3.5 years on track number 3, page 58, but as I've said, that if you will dig deeper, brothers and sisters, it does not, on the first advent of Jesus Christ, it does not exactly 3.5 years. But we need to prove that that statement in track number 3, page 58 must be absolutely perfect. Brothers and sisters, that there must be 3.5 years of Christ sowing the good seed. Of course, in the groundwork, if you will look at the groundwork, it does not exactly 3.5 years, or does not exactly 1,260 days. Showing that to complete the 1,260 days, the missing days on the first advent of Jesus Christ, it must be completed, brothers and sisters, during the judgment that pertains to the living. And it is closely connected to Isaiah 61, verse 1 and verse 2. Now, for example, I would like to read to you here on 1SR. Page 153. Let's read. The first verse and part of the second. The first verse and part of the second apply to Christ Himself at the beginning of His ministry. So, Isaiah 61, verse 1 and 2 apply to Christ Himself at the beginning of His ministry. When does Isaiah 61, verse 1 and 2 had been read by Jesus Christ? That is after the 40 days wilderness temptation. Right? After the 40 days, then He went into the synagogue of Nazareth. Now, let us read the Bible in Luke chapter 4. Luke chapter 4. So, verse 13. Luke chapter 4, verse 13. So, I would like to read the historical event. Luke chapter 4, verse 13. And when the devil had ended all the temptation, he departed from him for a season. So that is after the 40 days temptation in the wilderness ended. Verse 14. And Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit into Galilee, and there went out a fame of Him through all the region round about. And He taught in their synagogues, being glorified of all. And He came to Nazareth, where He had been brought up, and as His custom was, He went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and stood up for to read. And there was delivered unto Him the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when He had opened the book, He found the place where it was written, The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because He hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance of the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are browsed, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. And he closed the book, and he gave it again to the minister, and sat down. And the eyes of all them that were in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began to say unto them, This day is the scripture fulfilled in your ears. Luke chapter 4, verse 13 to verse 21. Now, let's ponder deeply, brothers and sisters. Going back to 1SR. 153. It says, 1SR page 153. The first verse and part of the second apply to Christ himself at the beginning of his ministry. Now, we already read Luke 4, verse 13 to verse 21. Isaiah 61, verse 1 and 2. It was read by Jesus Christ in the synagogue in Nazareth during Sabbath day. And that was after the wilderness temptation. So here, brothers and sisters, may calendar outside. Calendar. Violet day. Now, brothers and sisters, to repeat again, here in 1SR 153, the shepherd's rod made it so plain that the ministry of Christ began when he entered into the synagogue in Nazareth. And the very beginning of his ministry is reading Isaiah 61. Verses verse 1 and verse 2. So, let us look at the specific date. And we know that that is pattern number 2. So, that is, brothers and sisters, pattern number 2. So, Jesus Christ entered into the synagogue of Nazareth December 6, 27 AD, Saturday. The first Sabbath on the month of December, 27 AD. For the wilderness temptation ended on November 27. November 27, 27 AD. So Jesus Christ entered into the synagogue in Nazareth December 6, 27 AD. Now, let us now count the, I would like to count the exact number of days. Brothers and sisters, so, Bible calendar from December 6, 27 AD to April 16, 31 AD. How many days? December 6, 27 AD up to April 16, 31 AD. The crucifixion of Jesus Christ. So, December 6, 27 AD, up to April 16, 31 AD, there are only 1,210 days. So, 1,260 minus 1,200, 1,260 minus 1,210 days. So, there are 50 days lacking to complete the 3.5 years. So, let's go back again to track number 3, page 58. Track number 3 on page 58. So let's read. The 3.5 years from the beginning of Christ's ministry to His crucifixion, being the sowing time. How many years the sowing time? 3.5 years, or 1,260 days. 1,260 days. But in the historical event, how many days the sowing time on the first advent of Jesus Christ? Only 1,210 days. There are 50 days to complete the 1,260 days. And that missing number 50 days is the fulfillment of the statement here in 1 SR 153. Now let us read again. It says, the first verse and part of the second apply to Christ Himself at the beginning of His ministry. What is the ministry of Jesus Christ? Isaiah 61 verse 1 and 2. To set the captives free from the bottomless pit. Now let's read again the statement here. 1 SR 153. The first verse and part of the second apply to Christ Himself at the beginning of His ministry. The spirit of prophecy says it will repeat itself with the people of God. So Christ's ministry, the sowing, will be repeated. Why? Because it was predicted beforehand that the sowing of the good seed must be 1,260 days. And in the first advent of Jesus Christ, there are only 1,210 days. There are 50 days which is missing. And that 50 days must be the sowing time in the judgment that pertains to the living. Now, I would like to read again the statement here in 1 SR 153. The first verse and part of the second apply to Christ Himself at the beginning of His ministry. The prophecy says it will repeat itself with the people of God. This would find its fulfillment in the time of harvest with the 144,000. Now, it says, this would find its fulfillment in the time of harvest. And the harvest mentioned there is the harvest that pertains to the living, not the harvest that pertains to the dead. And this is the very message that we are now introducing to you. I remember the statement in 2TG number 11. 2TG number 11 on page 13, it says, other truths even more important must be introduced for the harvest of the living. Now, I would like to read beginning from page 12. For example, after the harvest, investigative judgment of the dead is passed. Although it is very broad, but if we will dig deeper, it is pointing to the judgment of the dead, which is pertaining to the third goal. Pertaining to the third goal, brothers and sisters, when the investigative judgment of the dead of the third call is passed. For example, if I would like to remind to you the statement in 2SR 222. Let's read. 2SR 222. In our study of the seven seals, we reserve for future explanation the following scripture. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts say, a measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny. Revelation 6 verse 6. Again, we turn the reader's attention to the fact that the voice came from the throne. See chapter 5 verse 11. Therefore, the price of the cereals is fixed by the great judge. There must be something of great importance in these symbols, for the great Jehovah himself is speaking. 2SR 222. Now, what is Revelation 6 verse 6? That is the description under the third seal. Why is it that it is in the third seal God the Father began to speak? Because it is parallel to Matthew 20. Because the subject there is Matthew 20. Brothers and sisters, the subject mentioned in 2SR 222 is Matthew chapter 20. Let's read 2SR 225. 225 and 226. With the previous explanation of Revelation 6 verse 6, a measure of wheat for a penny and 3 measures of barley for a penny, we shall endeavor to prove that the symbols point back to the parable of the householder. And Jesus allegorically looked forward to John's vision. If the explanation perfectly fits the parable and the vision, in harmony with God's book and law, and a present truth lesson is derived therefrom, then only must we accept it as truth. 2SR 225-226. So that reading plainly indicating that Revelation 6 verse 6 is closely connected to the parable in Matthew 20. In fact, when Jesus Christ gave the parable to the disciples, he's looking forward to the time when he himself will show the vision to John in the island of Patmos. But at the time when Jesus Christ showed the vision to John in the island of Patmos, Jesus Christ is looking backward to the time when he gave the parable. In short, Revelation 6 verse 6 is closely related to the parable in Matthew 20. So why is it that Jesus Christ or the Bible attached that predicted event when God the Father began to speak? On the third seal. No, it is not in the proceedings of the third seal that God the Father began to speak, but rather in connection in Matthew 20. God the Father began to speak when the proceedings of the third call is completely finished. When the investigative judgment of the dead, the entire proceedings that pertains to the third call, which is the Millerites movement, is completely finished. And it was completely finished on April 1, 2020, by which at that time, the remaining proceedings in the most holy place is the altar, the sixth seal. Although in the holy place, the entire proceedings that pertains to the dead is completely ended. But not in the most holy place, because in April 1, 2020, that is the commencement of the proceedings of the altar. Who are they, the altar? Revelation 14:13. Those who will be judged in the heavenly sanctuary while living and destined to die. but is closely connected to the subject, the fulfillment of Ezekiel 9, as stated in 2SR page 162. So I would like to go back again to our reading in 2TG, number 11. It says, page 12 and 13, for example, after the harvest, investigative judgment of the dead is passed. So it points out to, brothers and sisters, all the proceedings that pertains to the dead while the saints are lying unconscious in their graves. Although the proceedings in April 1, 2020 is pertaining to them who are to be resurrected, but it is, in reality, it is also called investigative judgment of the living. Because the one that had been considered in the heavenly sanctuary in April 1, 2020, they were still alive. So, investigative judgment of the living. Those saints who are judged while living. So, it cannot be called investigative judgment, brothers and sisters, of the dead. Because they were already, they were still alive and destined to die. So, I would like to read again the statement here in 2TG 11, pages 12 and 13. 2TG number 11, page 12 and 13. For example, after the harvest, investigative judgment of the dead is passed. Other truths, even more important, must be introduced. For the harvest of the living, I say more important truths because they are concerning the living themselves, concerning those whose own cases are to be weighed in the balances. Those who are personally are to be judged either as wheat or as tares, either as good fish or as bad fish. 2TG 11, page 12 and 13. And this is the very message that we are introducing to all the saints who are candidates to be translated to heaven without seeing death. So, brothers and sisters, it is a very important subject, and I'm trying my best with the help of the Lord that we could be able to grasp all the meaning concerning this very important subject, the 12 figurative months, but it's closely connected to the proceedings in the heavenly sanctuary. And the 12 figurative months is attached to the subject, the 12 parabolic month harvest. If you will read track number 3 on page track number 3 on page 54, let's read. It says, the 4 seasons of the year, all being required in completing the process of planting, raising, and harvesting the year's crops, and autumn being the beginning of the agricultural year, just as the close of the summer season is the feast of ingathering, which is in the end of the year, when thou hast gathered in thy labors out of thy field. Exodus 23, verse 16. This parable, therefore, illustrates by the 12 months of the year a period of gospel history, in the closing of which the kingdom of Christ is to be set up, and the beginning of which is the seed sowing time. So, the beginning of what? The kingdom of Christ to be set up. What kingdom? A spiritual kingdom. Because it says, and the beginning of which is the seed sowing time. But how many days? Only 50 days. The seed sowing time in the judgment that pertains to the living is only 50 days to complete the 3.5 years. The 1,260 days. The missing 50 days on the first advent of Jesus Christ, which is the groundwork. And that is why, what is the ministry of Jesus Christ? Isaiah 61 verse 1 and 2. And it says in 1 SR 153, that ministry of Jesus Christ, Isaiah 51:1 and 2, will be repeated again in the time of the harvest. What harvest? Judgment that pertains to the living. Because judgment and harvest, according to track number 3 on page, track number 3, let's read the statement given by the Shepherd's Rod. It says, page 88, the judgment is the harvest. You see? Track number 3, page 88, the judgment is the harvest. So, the judgment that pertains to the dead, that is harvest that pertains to the dead. The judgment that pertains to the living, that is the harvest that pertains to the living, by which the first fruits is the 144,000 living saints. We will continue the subject on our next episode, hoping that the good Lord will bless us and will help us. Thank you very much for listening and viewing this program. Have a beautiful, wonderful evening.